Well, I am very, very pleased today to introduce Senator Phil Fortunato. He is been a major champion of litter in the last many legislative sessions, has introduced quite a few bills. And so Senator Fortunato, let me turn it over to you. And may I recommend to everyone put your view on speaker view, and then you'll have the senator and his slide as your main thing that you see.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for participating in Zero Waste Washington's Litter Summit, and thank Heather for taking the chance to actually inviting me to speak. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. It took 3 years to pass my Welcome to Washington Act, which prioritized litter pickup primarily along our highways. The title of the act comes from the big sign that you see when you enter Washington coming in from Oregon, only to be greeted by a couch on the side of the road. We want people, we want our residents, we want our visitors to come to our state, to visit our parks, to visit our mountains, for the beauty of our state, and to go home and not say how much trash there was on the side of the road. Zero Waste has a big job in hand then, not only in reducing the litter itself, pardon me, not only in reducing the litter itself, but the cause of the litter to begin with. I hope the program will help lead to a better environment for everybody. And when people ask you what you did for the last 2 days, you can say you talked about trash. So enjoy the summit, and thank you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Senator.
I'm introducing Jeff Kirschner. He's the CEO of Litterati, which is a data science company empowering people to create a litter-free world. Jeff's here to present on how litter data is changing policy, packaging, and personal responsibility. So I'll hand it over to Jeff.
Amber, thank you so much. And hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you all here today. I actually had the honor of speaking at Washington's Litter-Free Summit many years ago. And so it's great to be back. And hopefully the next time we'll be in person. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I may, and we will go ahead and get started. So at Litterati, we are on a mission to create a litter-free world. And tell me if this story sounds a little familiar. We're in this vicious cycle. And this has really been going on for several decades. And the cycle looks a little bit something like this. We're all demanding change. We are tired of what has become the status quo. And because we demand change, well, many NGOs and groups, they advocate for tighter policy to try to make that change. Brands inevitably end up getting blamed, but government is who bears the cost, to the tune of billions of dollars every single year. The common thread that everybody is looking for is data. And that shouldn't be a light bulb moment, right? You're probably hearing about data in most of the meetings or conferences that you attend. And our position at Litterati is that that is absolutely the way to solve this problem. But we've kind of been going about it all wrong. Let me tell you what I mean. So for many, many years, the following methods have been used. We've been counting bags, right? Earth Day. You probably see a picture on Instagram of a bunch of people arm in arm in front of a bunch of trash bags with a beautiful beach backdrop. And maybe they're saying, hey, we picked up 10 bags this year, and that's 5 more bags than we picked up last year. That's great, but in a way, it sort of gives the illusion of progress. Others have been collecting data using pencils and clipboards. I probably don't have to get into why that is problematic and not taking advantage of today's modern technologies. And then some cities have been a little bit more progressive, and they'll do visual assessments. I've seen counties do it, some states, but cities typically will do a visual assessment. If you're not familiar with this scoring, it is usually on a 1 through 4 scale, and 2 people will oftentimes get in a vehicle and drive around the city. 1 will have a clipboard or a spreadsheet on a tablet and grade it if it's 1 clean and 4 dirty. And then that may be done maybe twice a year. So not very often. Our belief is that there's a much better way and a much more granular way to collect data at scale in a way that is statistically significant, scientifically accurate. It can really do three things. Number one, it can be used to inform policy, because we believe that if you really want to eradicate litter, truly make a change, government has to play a role. That data can also be used to influence packaging. We believe that brands and producers have responsibility to create much more sustainable materials. And the third way that data can play a role is, frankly, it can inspire all of us. It can inspire us to be part of a greater good and to leave this place a little bit better than we found it. And that's really what we're doing at Literati. Let me give you an idea of how it all started. So often our kids are the ones that get us to see the world in a way that we hadn't. My story began because of these two, my daughter Tali and my son Shai. And we were hiking through the woods in Northern California, a place known for being environmentally responsible and ecologically progressive. And they noticed this plastic tub of cat litter lying in a creek. And my daughter looked at me and she said, "Daddy, that doesn't go there." And it was, for me, the eye-opening moment. Maybe some of you have had similar eye-opening moments. I was never an active environmentalist, but seeing the world through my daughter's eyes opened my own. And when she said that, it reminded me of when I used to go to camp as a kid, summertime. When we were at camp on the morning of visiting day, the camp director would say, "Quick, everybody go pick up 5 pieces of trash." And so you'd have a couple hundred kids, we're each picking up a few pieces. And within a few minutes, we had a much cleaner camp. And I thought, well, why not apply that crowdsourced method to the entire planet? And what if you could use technology to do it? And that was really the inspiration for starting Literati. I got to tell you, what happened next was a little bit strange. So this is back in 2012. I took a photograph of this cigarette butt using Instagram. I can't really tell you why I did it. I just did it. And then I took a number of other photographs. I took one of a bottle cap. I took one of a Pepsi bottle. I took one of a Red Bull can. And I noticed two things happening to me. The first was litter became artistic. And the second reason is that it became approachable, right? So the bottle cap that was on the ground that I maybe didn't notice suddenly was an interesting photo opportunity. And so I started picking up litter in different areas. This is right where they used to go to school. And what happened was that as the community of people started to grow, well, the data grew as well. And this for me was a real eye-opening moment it's about the data and how that can be used to prevent the problem at the source. Let me give you a little idea of what we've been building at Literati and how that's used to change policy and packaging and personal responsibility. We like to say it starts with an image. Simple, yet sophisticated. So many of you probably can look at this picture and see that on the ground, there was a Red Bull can that I picked up. It's probably not too difficult to figure out, but what the machine learning models do, and machine learning models are sophisticated computer vision that we have built into the Literati mobile application. Those machine learning models can see everything that we can't, like a cigarette butt or a bottle cap. And once they see them, they can then classify them. So they can say, all right, well, what are those objects? Is that a can? Is it a lid? Cigarette? And then once they identify what the objects are, they can understand, well, what is the material? And when possible, what's the brand? And it's this level of granularity that can inform really interesting stories around the data. And so what we're doing is we're taking this idea, this technology, and applying it to the streets. So that now, instead of looking at this, you're able to turn that into this. You're able to understand exactly what is leaking out of the system. What are the objects, materials, brands? Where are they located? We like to talk about Literati in terms of what, where, and when, because that information can be the foundation for beginning to identify the source. And perhaps more importantly, identify where to place our resources, which we all know are so limited. And once you're able to collect that level of data at such a granular point, you can turn this into this. Heat maps and other interesting data visualizations so that you can really start to get a sense of what's going on in my neighborhood, what's going on in my city, in my state, in my county. So we've taken that and then we've turned it into a dashboard. Because this is Washington, I wanted to give a quick example of a recent snapshot that I took of the Seattle area to give you a sense of what's happening. So this is just in Seattle 2022. In the purview that I'm giving you, that's 10,000 individual pieces of litter that have been identified by people in the literati community or some of our data scientists who are professional researchers who are out in the streets around Washington. Let me direct your attention to the left-hand side. Those 10,000 items, they all have a weight. We've placed that into our database so that we know a Coke can weighs X or a cigarette weighs Y. And they also have a volume. On the right-hand side, you can start to understand what are the categories of these 10,000 pieces. And then once you break that up, you can start to understand, all right, well, how does this really apply? What does this look like in a dashboard? And we can take Seattle and start to break it down. Well, what are the brands? Out of the material that you see here, Modelo, Ziploc, I'm not sure what Spa is, to be honest. Starbucks, that shouldn't come as a surprise. McDonald's, Bud Light, these are the most commonly found brands within this area. And then when you look at the materials, well, what are they? Well, the most common materials found here are plastic and cellulose acetate, which is what is the primary material within cigarettes. And then what are the objects? Well, this is not in order of preference, excuse me, in order of prevalence, but just alphabetical. But you can start to understand what are the different objects that we're finding out there. And then you can turn all of that into other interesting data sets. So every one of these red dots right here is a Starbucks location. And the yellow that you see behind it is part of that heat map. Where are the higher density areas of litter that we're finding? What are the different other layers of data that your city, your county, your state can integrate to help understand what is the primary source of litter? Where is it coming from? So we work with a number of cities who provide data sets like storm drain locations or topography. We're starting to look at weather, things of this nature, because they all play a role in understanding the source of the litter. We believe that you do need to clean up, but that's only one half of this. In order to really solve the problem, you need to identify what's leaking out of the system, where it's leaking out, and when. And as you zoom in, you can start to get a really interesting understanding of the individual points of litter, where they're being found in a particular neighborhood. And then you can even, in our dashboard, click on any one of those dots, and you'll see exactly what is that item. And you can start to get a sense, okay, this is a plastic cup, very close to a Starbucks store, which is the red dot right there. So and this was taken on within about a week's period of time. So if you expanded this out to a month, 6 months, how much other data around that particular Starbucks would you begin to identify? What else could you learn? What other insights could you glean from this? So when it comes to informing policy or packaging or personal responsibility, let me give you some examples that have happened over the last couple of years. One is we do a lot of work with cities, and this happened years ago, and it was a big eye-opening moment for me, and it was with the city of San Francisco. Now, the city of San Francisco had a very, very specific question. They wanted to understand what percentage of litter came from cigarette-related material. Why? Because they wanted to create a tax on all cigarette sales. And so long before Literati existed, they gave people pencils and clipboards. And those folks walked around and collected data saying, that's a cigarette, that's not, that is, that's not. And that information was used to create a 20-cent tax on all cigarette sales. Well, the city then got sued by the tobacco industry, who claimed that pencils and clipboards weren't precise nor provable. There was no accuracy. There was no scientific evidence that the city could use to create this tax. We were brought in, and because everything has a photograph and a timestamp, our data was used to not only defend, but double that tax, generating approximately $4 million a year for the city of San Francisco to clean itself up. And from this process, we learned a couple of things. One, if you could start to really understand the lay of the land for San Francisco, well, you could pretty much do it for any city in the world. You could begin to, as we say, fingerprint a city. You could start to understand exactly what are those objects, materials, and brands, where are they leaking, and how could a city use this data in a way that it never has to either change packaging or inform new policy or inspire personal responsibility. If you could do it for San Francisco, then you could certainly do it for Amsterdam, or you could do it for some of our most treasured places in the United States. A second example of how our data has been used is with brands. So one of my favorite stories took place in downtown Oakland, not far from where my children used to go to school. This block is about as soiled and littered as you can imagine. I used to walk it every day. And so a few people from the literati community got together and picked up about 1,500 pieces. That's great. But what was more interesting from our perspective was when we started to look at the data, most of the pieces that they had identified and picked up came from Taco Bell. And most of the Taco Bell related litter were their single-use packets of hot sauce. So now you're starting to get down to that fundamental level. What could you do with this information? Well, maybe if you wanted, as Taco Bell, you could start to say, if anybody wants hot sauce, you just have to order it. We're not going to give away these packets, by the way, many of which have never even been opened. So Taco Bell was not only losing money, but it's obviously causing this environmental hazard. So how can a brand begin to take responsibility for its packaging in a way that actually becomes an economic driver for them, right? This is probably worth a penny of sauce and a penny in plastic. But when you multiply that by the thousands of Taco Bells all over the world, and you do that not just over a day, but over years, it starts to add up. And all of a sudden, they become an environmental hero as opposed to a villain in the story. This happened not too long ago. This is a cough drop found in Holland. It's called Antiflu, like anti-flu. The Dutch literati community got together and picked up about 30,000 of these plastic wrappers. And they took the data to the CEO of the company. The company is called Pervasco. Presented this data to their CEO, and the CEO, to his credit, said, give me a year, I'm going to change the supply chain. And that's exactly what they did. These are no longer wrapped in plastic. They're now wrapped in paper and sealed with wax. It's amazing what just a few people can do when they're armed with a tool and a technology and given the data to actually make a change. Another great story out of Holland. These are about the size of a golf ball. They're little fireworks made out of plastic. Well, again, the Dutch community came together and identified over 50,000 of these all over the Netherlands. As a result of the data, their leading retailers put a moratorium on selling any of these plastic fireworks, because you can imagine when they explode, plastic fragments end up all over the ground. And once again, a simple story, people coming together, using a tool to collect data and going right to the source, in this case, the retailer, and saying, look what's happening. And that retailer saying, all right, we're going to make a change. And they did. We've done a lot of work with schools over the years. And we like to say, if you're going to make change, there's nobody better to start with than our children. And one of my favorite stories was arguably the first story of impact I had ever heard. And it took place in a place called Modesto, California, where fifth graders picked up 1,247 items just on their schoolyard. And they learned from the data that the most common type of litter on their schoolyard were the plastic straw wrappers from their own cafeteria. And so these students went to their principal and said, why are we even buying straws? And they stopped. And individually they learned that they could make a difference, but it was together. That's where they really created the impact. And I think that's what's so special about a convening like this one is here we are, 136 people on this call, all contributing to this greater good. All, I think, wondering, how can we make an impact? How can we as individuals make a difference? But together, how can we create an impact in the state of Washington? And what are the different things we can learn from one another? And I'm here to offer the idea that we need to keep cleaning up. But if we want to really prevent litter so that our children don't have to deal with this problem, that there's another way. And that other way is through the use of data. And what's been interesting is that we started with 2 little kids making a comment to me in the Northern California woods. And today we've built this platform that's now supporting people across the world. And the key, if I had to say there was one key thing that I'd love to leave you with, it's this. How do we measure change over time? We've all been sort of chasing this almost impossible aspiration of a litter-free world. And we've been chasing it, I would say, and I'm certainly, I've contributed to this. We've been chasing it in a way that says, if we just pick up more and more and more, that's going to solve the problem. And the measuring that we've been doing really hasn't told us if we're getting any better. How do we know if the educational curriculum that we put in our schools is really making a difference? How do we know if the new infrastructure that's placed in a city, the new MRF facility, the new policy, how do we know if they're actually making a difference? That's where data really can play a role. It can help you understand change over time. Is there evidence of progress? And so when we think about this goal of a litter-free world and the role that data can play and how it can contribute to measuring change over time, we see a world in the not too distant future with these sort of irrefutable truths. The first is that technology is only going to get more commonplace and more effective. There are going to be countless ways to contribute data, whether it's through a mobile application, whether it's through a Google Streetcar, a fleet of drones flying along a beach, or even satellite imagery. And these technologies are here now. So this is only going to continue. How can we collect more and more data? We also believe that producers have a role to play, and that data is going to inform their responsibility. It is going to tell them whether or not they're getting better or worse over time. And ultimately, if you go back to where we started, this notion of government is the one that bears the cost, this data can really be used to supply government with the insight that it needs. Instead of today, which is, well, it's dirty out there, let's just go put more people, more resources, it can actually allow us to identify where to prioritize. It can detect leaks in the circular economy, in the system. And once again, it can really assess, are we making any progress or not? We've got a planet to clean, and we hope you'll join us. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I would be happy to answer any questions. Amber, I believe you'll let me know.
Yeah. So there's some conversation in the chat about when the heat map came up of Seattle, and they were pointing out that what that heat map is showing to them is that some of the more affluent, wealthier areas have more interaction with the app. It doesn't mean that there's more litter in those areas. And so how can we, you know, level that out and get the data and the interaction we need in more underserved areas that and leverage that data to, you know, prioritize cleanups in communities that might not be represented currently?
It's a great question. So let me give you an overview of how Literati works. There are 2 aspects to our business. The first is the community. And those are people, it can be anybody who downloads the application, Android or iOS, and can identify litter wherever they like. Obviously, that has bias, right? That may have bias, like Amber said. Some people in wealthier communities may have access to a device, and other people in underserved communities may not have access to that device. And the data that was represented there, the heat map, actually, there is no correlation in that snapshot that I took with those different socioeconomics, but admittedly, they exist. The other aspect of our business is what we call Analyze. And in Analyze, we actually put trained scientists and researchers into an environment. So we're doing this currently with a number of cities throughout the US, where we will do a statistically significant, what's called geospatial sampling. And there is no bias, meaning we work with the city to identify what are the locations, and then we place those people in those locations. It could be anywhere from 300 locations to several thousand, and we will collect all of that data. And it is intended to provide a true representative sample of any given city.
Great. Along the same lines, can you give an example of when you all have engaged a lower income community with the Literati app when they weren't engaged before, and how that might have gone?
So there have been times in the past where I've personally gone into a number of underserved communities where I used to live, Oakland, California. And that may have been me speaking at a class, a school, or at multiple schools within one time, and had them engage for an Earth Day event. Typically, what we found is that engagement is tough. It doesn't matter what socioeconomic class you're talking to, getting people to engage in cleaning up is not easy. But what we have found works is that when there's oftentimes like a moment in cultural time, like an Earth Day or a World Cleanup Day, it's easier to rally people around that. And then they may go out for a day, a week, a month. Sometimes that has gone really well. But I will tell you that, as you all know, engaging people is very, very difficult. Again, we have found it doesn't really matter what the demographic is.
There's a question here. Do you have an example of where the data showed an improvement in a particular area?
We have several of those. One that's been really fascinating came out of France. So there's a town called La Rochelle, and what they wanted to know specifically was, we're going to put in a bunch of new types of trash cans. So they went from open container to closed container, and they wanted to know, did those trash cans make a difference? And so what we did was a multi-phase measurement, a multi-phase analysis. It always starts with a baseline. You have to know, where are you starting today? And then an input comes into the system, in this case, new trash cans, and then a measurement to determine, did that input have a difference or not? And what we were able to prove or demonstrate was that in this case, those trash cans absolutely made a difference in terms of the amount of litter that was found on the ground. That's one example, but there are several others.
Perfect. Can Literati randomly select sampling sites to correct for sampling bias or factor in urban versus rural sampling sites?
We do. I am not the right person to answer how exactly we do that sort of geospatial sampling, but our data science team will work with a city government or state government to ensure that there is not a sampling bias when it comes to the research locations. It's a little bit art and a little bit science. Where it's art, it might be, so if we put into our algorithm, you know, what are the research locations we need to do in, I'm making this up, Topeka, Kansas, the algorithm may put what we call a segment or a location in an airport. We're not going to go sample data in an airport, or oftentimes it can be along a rail or along railways, right, along a train track. Other times we will have sampling that may go into an area that it's just not possible for one reason or another to collect data on a given day. Or even what we have found is more telling, or I should say more challenging, is there may be street sweeping on that day. So the data that we collect isn't going to be relevant. We need to take those sorts of data sets like street sweeping and locations of railways into consideration when we make that sampling.
I know in talking with people about Literati, some people were saying it might be difficult to hold a smartphone while you're trying to get litter. And I saw that there's some creative solutions to that. Can you maybe talk about how people have modified the litter grabbers and making pickup and use of the app easier?
There is no question that cleaning up and collecting data at the same time can be laborious. And I would be a fool to tell you otherwise. Some people in the community have actually built smart litter pickers. They have taken a traditional stick with a grabber and put a holster and their phone and pointed the camera right at the pinchers on the ground. A Bluetooth trigger, they fire up the Literati application, and they're collecting data. We've had other people who use drones. It is not easy to do both at the same time. Certainly not impossible. We have people in our community that pick up, and I know this is hard to believe, 1,000 pieces a day and collect all of that data. But again, our belief is that we can keep cleaning up, and we need to, but at the end of the day, it's the data that's going to ultimately lead to, we believe, the change that we all want.
And I think we have time for one last question. What is the use of the community data input beyond getting people engaged? Seems like that data isn't really statistically significant geosampling data.
Yeah, April, it's a great point. So what it is used for beyond getting people engaged, which let's not discount that, that's a huge part of it, is it tickles, if you will, or can serve as a teaser for a city. Because what we've been able to say is, look, here's a sampling of data that is in your city right now. If you really want to start to address the problem, we can begin to do it in a statistically significant, scientifically accurate way. That's typically the role that that data can play.
All right, so we're going to wrap up. It looks like there's one more question in the chat, but I can let you answer that in the chat if you